Intention is to get you out on time or even a little bit before that so we can relax a little bit, have a nice lunch, and then come back for 2 more sessions. My next 2 sessions now, we're going to be getting away from the pandemic and what's coming and all of that stuff. The next 2 sessions, we're going to start talking about what before the pandemic was my anchor talk, where we start talking about some size differential issues to help us understand how the big small church divide has happened in our culture, how we can respond well to it without causing further division, but why it is that small churches and big churches do pastor differently, and how we can approach that a little bit better. So this session is entitled Redefining Success in Ministry. So just to catch everybody up to speed, especially for those of you who may not have been able to attend last night, I pastor in Southern California, 8 miles south of Disneyland. A lot of people around there, but a very, very small church, although on a crowded street, a very small building. We were there, we came into a church that had been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. They had almost voted to close the church completely. We had come out of a church that had been a very difficult season for us, a toxic environment, so we were bruised and beaten, they were bruised and beaten. For the first 7 years that we were there, we just simply tried to get healthy as much as we could. For the next 7 or 8 years, we got into a bit of a growth point. And at about 15 years, we were running 200. In the next 2 years, after renting the local junior high's Kappa Gym Torah librarian that I told you about last night, we actually grew in under 2 years from 200 to 400 people. And then in the next year, we collapsed from 400 to well under 100, and many Sundays under 50. And there had been no scandal, and there had been no split. That was the season when I found myself walking away for 40 days, almost leaving ministry entirely, going to a counselor who helped me, and at one point the counselor told me, we have to figure out how to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And it was in my process of trying to figure out how to do that I started writing things that eventually led to my first book into this ministry that brings me here with you today. So the question that comes up is, and the question that I had to figure out partly was, after an explosive season of growth, going from 200 to 400, I've given 15 years to get to 200, 2 years from 200 to 400, then less than a year from 400 back down to under 100 again, and sometimes under 50. That's a severe shifts in numbers. And the question that we had to figure out eventually was, what had caused the collapse? Why did we drop from 400 down to 50-ish within a year with no scandal or no split? And in the years since then, we have looked back and we've discovered there were 3 primary principles why that happened. First of all, it was all of our growth from 200 to 400 in 2 years. It was all transfer growth from other churches. It was not conversion growth. So we were not leading people to Christ or making disciples. We were entertaining bored Christians. And we were the hot church in town for 2 years. And so people came to see, for a little while, we were putting on a slightly better Sunday morning religious show than some of the other churches around. Let's be honest about it, that's what it was. And then when somebody else got hot and we cooled down, they all left and they took a bunch of our regular folks with them. So that was part of it. Secondly, we had not discipled people to lead. Remember, I told you part of the story last night was when we got to 400, I went to our church leadership council and I said, we need to hire staff for a church of 600 because that's where we're about to head to. We did so, we hired staffing for 600. And why did we do that? Well, we had to do that because me and one other staff member and the rest of our volunteers, we were doing all of the ministry for a church as it grew from 200 to 400 in 2 years, and all the ministry was on our backs. Why? Because we hadn't discipled them to minister to each other and to take care of themselves. We just had more people to take care of. And that's not the biblical pattern for pastoring, as we talked about last night. Our calling is to equip God's people for works of service, not simply to do the work for them. And so we hadn't been discipling people. So people ask me occasionally, well, if your church all of a sudden started growing real big again, what would happen? And well, first of all, this ministry would be completely ruined. I may be the only pastor in America whose side ministry would be ruined if my church got too big. just kind of weird. That's a joke. The bottom line is truly is this. Our church could double again in the next 2 years. If it did happen, we're not pushing for that, but if it did happen, we could do that now without hiring a single person from the outside, because we have leaned really heavily into discipleship. We are discipling people who become disciple makers. And so now, even as we have the steady departure of people, there are always people in the pipeline to come along behind them and to step up and to replace them. Most of the time, because of that, we're kind of working with the B team. I'm actually on our church is kind of on the hotline for other churches around us. When they need a staff member, we're on the list of people they call and go, who have you been training up recently? Because they hire them away from us sometime, but we've got somebody behind them. So part of our decided mission over the last few years has been, we are going to be a church that raises up people that then serve other churches as they move away. When they move, we want them to be a blessing somewhere else. And if they stay, we hope that they'll continue to be a blessing for us. So we weren't discipling people, and now we are discipling people who become disciple makers. And that's making a big difference for us. So we don't have to hire from the outside. It doesn't mean we won't at some point if we grew, but we don't need to. But thirdly, this is the third reason I'm giving you this warning, but it's the first reason that I discovered was this. During that season that our church was growing from 200 to 400 in less than 2 years was one of the most miserable times I've ever had in ministry. And I didn't know I was miserable. Because how can a pastor be miserable when the church is doubling in 2 years? But what I discovered later was I was happy twice a week. I was happy when everybody showed up on Sunday, and I was happy when I got the growth report on Monday. The rest of the time I was miserable. Why? Because from 200 to going to 400, you have to shift the way you pastor. You can no longer be the shepherd. You have to be what they call the rancher. You can no longer be the hands-on pastor. You have to be the administrative manager. You have to. You simply can't physically be there for everybody anymore. So you have to hand off most of the pastoral duties to other people. And I did that willingly. And I was miserable. Because I was spending 90% of my ministry hours doing things that I don't like, that I'm not called to, and that suck my soul dry. I was spending 90% of my ministry hours raising funds, trying to find a new building, arguing with City Hall, coordinating teams, and none of it shepherding the people. Not none of it, but very, very little of it shepherding the people. And I have discovered since then that that's not what I'm called to do, that's not what I'm gifted at, and that's not what feeds my soul. So I was becoming an empty shell on the inside by doing things that I'm not called to do. And as I talk to other pastors, what I discover is this. When I ask pastors, so when you think about when you were first felt a call to ministry, what was it that you actually imagined yourself doing as a pastor? And most of them will say something like preaching on Sunday morning, visiting the sick, baptizing, being there for folks, putting together Bible studies, and almost all of the things that most pastors describe as what they expected to be doing ministry are small church shepherding tasks. Very few pastors, when I talk to them, will say, when I first got called to ministry, what I really pictured myself doing was raising funds and building bigger buildings and putting together leadership teams. Now, there are some who do that and who do it well, and I'm grateful for them, because if everybody pastored the way I pastor, we'd still be worshiping in caves. Nothing would ever get built, because that's just not me. Your building fund program, I can feel the weight in my chest right now saying the words. Don't tell me about I don't even want to improve the house. Shelley has to take care of all of that, because I'm just like, I'm going to go on vacation for 3 months while you fix up the house, tell me when it's done, I'll come back. It's just not me. It wipes me out, it sucks me dry. And so I was doing all of this, and I did it willingly. But what happened was, people, even as people were leaving, we were asking them, why are you going? What's going on? And they'd say, we don't know why, but something feels off. And part of it, at least, was they were being led by a pastor who was not comfortable in his own skin at the numerical growth of the church, because I had to shift my role. Now, if it happened again, would I still be miserable? No, because now the people who would be stepping up and leading wouldn't be people I hired in, but they would be people who I discipled, who discipled others, and I'll be like a spiritual parent, grandparent, and great-grandparent, and that's still pastoral. So we could do that now, because now I'd be watching my spiritual children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren stepping up into places of leadership, and that's very different than hiring somebody in from the outside. Right? To use the baseball analogy, for those of you who know sports and for those of you who don't, It's a simple enough explanation. You've got teams like the New York Yankees, and they've been famous for years for whenever somebody really becomes a great player, they just throw a ton of money at them and hire them in. And then you've got Kansas City Royals, right, who not a big market, don't have a lot of money. So what do? They build a big farm team. They raise up and train their own people because they don't have deep pockets. And they have raised a competitive team by raising up their own people because they're not the New York Yankees that can just hire in from the outside. Most of our churches are Kansas City Royals type churches. We don't have deep pockets, but we have the ability and the mandate to raise up disciples who become disciple makers. People ask me, where do you get all of your great leaders from? We didn't get them, we made them. We trained them, we equipped them, and we continue to do that as part of our process. So that really changes everything. So that was what happened to us, and those are some of the corrections that we've made moving forward. And so out of that, let's talk about what does it mean to redefine success in ministry. And again, you can scan the QR code, you can go to that website to get any of the notes. We're going to take a look at how small churches can be healthy and effective. And we're going to do it by taking a look at three different things. The first thing you got to do is you got to realize that you can be effective while you're small. Secondly, we have to discover how small churches function differently from big churches. And then thirdly, understand and use the unique DNA of your small church for God's glory. These are how we can understand that a small church can be healthy. And again, if you're in a larger church, a whole lot of this is speaking from the small church experience, but would also speak well into your experience also. So let's take a look at these one at a time. First of all, you have to realize that your small church can be an effective church. Our congregation that I serve is now an effective church because we've leaned into discipleship, and the Lord is now helping us to have an impact both at home and around the world. And every small church can be effective. It's not about size, it's about our effectiveness. Let me give you an example of how some of this started to reconfigure within my own heart and spirit during the season I went through. So I went through that season, I left for 40 days, I came back after the 40 days. The bigger miracle of that is that they welcomed me back after that 40 days, after I nearly killed a good church. They welcomed me back with open arms, and in fact, I will remember and be grateful forever that the board, before my first Sunday back, the board actually called me and said, we want to meet with you tonight. The entire board wants to meet with you tonight. It was a Thursday before my first Sunday back, and I thought, oh boy, I'm in trouble. Shelley and I prayed with each other. She sent me off, and I walked into the room with the board members there, and our deacons looked at me, and they said, so how you doing? First of all, good. And then they looked at me and they said, do you need any more time? Because if you do, we'll give it to you. We don't need you back right away, but we want you back healthy whenever that is. And I tell you, that right there was the first symbol picture to me of God's graciousness during that season, and that we were going to be okay. Not just as a family, but as a congregation. I knew at that point our future was going to be good. If that's the attitude of the leaders in our church, that we just want you back healthy, and even if you need to leave for a while, that's okay, we're with you. That was huge for me. So I came back, and then I went to our annual denominational meeting for Southern California. And at the annual denominational meeting, the head of our denomination got up, and every year would give the state of the denomination report, as he should. And every year as he gave that report, part of it was numerical, as it ought to be. So it was, we had, opened this many churches, closed this many churches, added this many new members, or lost this many new members, whatever it was. He would give some of those stats, gave this much money to missions, and so on. And part of the numerical stats that were given every year always included this stat. Over 90% of our churches are under 200, and over 80% of our churches are under 100, which is shockingly consistent across denominations, across countries, and across regions. Most of our churches are small. Almost every denominational leader that I speak to, after they actually check the numbers, come to me and go, we're really just a group of small churches, almost universally. But every time after he would give those stats, which didn't change year to year, almost every single time, the next sentence after that sentence was always some version of, we need to fix this problem. And every year that I heard it for a few years, my reaction was, oh no. Here's this leader that I respect. He's talking about all of the churches. I'm one of those churches. He's just described 90% are under 200, 80% of us are under 100. This is a problem to fix. And I went, oh no, I'm part of the problem. Because except for that 1 year, we were always under 200, and quite often we were under 100. Oh no, I don't want to be a part of the problem. I want to be a part of the solution. And so every year I'd leave there determined that I was going to get bigger so that next year I wouldn't be a part of the problem anymore. I went back this year after that time away, and the same thing happened. Got up and gave that stat. And I knew the next sentence was going to be some version of, we need to fix this. And have you ever been in a room and somebody's speaking and they say something that triggers something in your head, so you go off on a thought process here while the speakers are way over here? It might be happening to some of you right now. I know, because I do it too. I did that then. I knew what the next sentence was going to be. So as he's going on telling us why it's a problem and a plan to fix it, over here, my reaction that year changed. Something broke in me and my reaction changed from oh no to so what? So what? Okay, fine. Our church is small. So what? We got a lot of small churches around. So what? I don't care anymore. Now here's the deal. When somebody gets to the point where they say, I don't care anymore, what that actually means is they are so tired of caring so deeply that they can't even acknowledge it to themselves anymore because the hurt runs so deep. That's what I don't care anymore means. That's where I was. So what? I don't care anymore. I'm done with this. But I'm stubborn. So when I ask so what, I want to find out so what. So I did the research. Here's what I discovered. The number of small churches within a group says nothing about the health of the churches in that group by itself. Here's why. I want you to imagine a group of churches, and in that group of churches for a season they are in renewal and revival and in growth mode. Part of renewal, revival, and growth mode for a group of churches, part of that growth will involve the planting of new churches. And when we plant new churches, what size do they tend to be? Small. So when a group of churches is in renewal, revival, and growth mode, they're planting more churches, which means more small churches, which means the percentage of small to big remains high even when you're in renewal and revival. Likewise, when you're in decline, the number of people in each church continues to decline, so the number of small to large remains high. The ratio of small to large remains that shockingly consistently, whether the churches involved are in renewal and revival and growth or whether they're in decline. So that number by itself is not enough. Now, we need to know what those numbers are, but we need to add other facts and other data to it to know what those numbers mean. By themselves, those numbers don't tell us enough. That is not an indicator of health. Size is never an indicator of health by itself. Decline or increase, number of churches, there are other things you have to factor in to understand whether this is a statement of health or decline and where it fits in the whole thing. So we have to realize that. So I went from the oh no and then to the so what, and then I discovered that, and then I shifted from so what to, okay, now what? Wow, okay, my church is small. We have a lot of small churches. Now what? And as I was in this mode of trying to figure out now what, I was sitting down one day and I was scanning through the TV, like I used to do. Now it's just, I know where I want to go and find it. But remember back in the day when you used to channel surf? There used to be channels. Now there's no channels. Now it's just everything all the time, right? And I ran across Apollo 13 and I went, oh, I haven't seen that movie in a while. And it was getting just about to this scene. A wonderful scene, and of course, if you've seen the movie or not, you know about it. Apollo 13, of course, was supposed to have been the third moon landing. And on the way to the moon, they had damaged the spacecraft, and so they couldn't land on the moon. And what was going to be an exploratory mission on the moon turned into a rescue mission, and they didn't know if they could get the 3 astronauts back to Earth alive. And the movie chronicles all of this, one problem after another after another. And at one point, they're rushing to mission control, and the guy goes, okay, we got a problem. They're running out of air filters. And he goes, how can we run out of air? How did we not send up enough air filters with them? Well, we did, but some of them are in the landing module, which of course we didn't use because they didn't land on the moon. So he said, well, the landing module is still attached. Have them go over, pick it up, and bring it into where they are. And he says, we've done that. They're a totally different shape and size. They don't fit. To which, in the movie at least, the head of mission control goes, wow. That is not what he said. Apollo 13 coming in for a landing. To which the head of mission, Mr. Roll, goes, tell me this isn't a government program? So, the very next scene then is a couple engineers take 2 big boxes filled with material and they dump it on a couple big tables in front of all the other engineers. And essentially what they tell the assembled engineers is this: everything that's on this table is everything that's on Apollo 13. If it's not on this table, it's not on Apollo 13, and the astronauts can't use it. So, using only what's on this table, you have to figure out how to fit this into this, or they die and the clock is ticking. And, by the way, there's not one single thing on this table that is designed to do this job. Get it done, or they're dead. I don't know a better description of what it's like to pastor a small church than that. Really? Lord, this is the supplies you've given me? Yes, and the mission hasn't changed and lives are at stake. Get the job done. With this. Yeah, with that. I think part of the reason Jesus chose the 12 apostles that he chose was so that in 21st century America, when we looked around and went, I can't work with these people, Jesus can go, well... And I chose them. I picked Judas. I picked Peter. Thomas, my choice. Right? I think that's part of the reason he did that, so he could show it's really not about that. Now, there's another great saying also that I want to add to this, and then we'll combine the two together. Jim Collins wrote a book several years ago called Good to Great, and it's actually a very, very good book. And in it, probably the most famous saying that's come out of it is, he says that when you're in business and you're putting together your main leadership team, he says you've got to get the right people on the bus. It's become a big saying in business and in leadership in recent years, right? You've got to get the right people on the bus, okay? And what he means by that is if you pick the wrong people for your team, they're not going to get along, they're not going to fit, and the whole thing will go down. Picking the right leadership team is one of the primary jobs of leadership. You've got to get the right people on the bus. The challenge in the small church is this: what happens when Apollo 13 crashes into your bus? Right? In a small church, we hear, got to get the right people on the bus, and we look around and go, right people on the bus? These are my people, this is my bus. I've got an Apollo 13 table mess. What you call the wrong people, I lovingly call it my church members. Right? There's no right people, wrong people, there's just what we've got. Right? And when you say, get the right people on the bus, in a small church, I'm looking at it and going, you're acting like I have a choice here. I don't have options here. I have an Apollo 13 table mess. But lives are at stake and the mission hasn't changed, but I've still got to get the job done. Right? That's what we're faced with as small church pastors. And it's a challenge, but it's also a joy because they don't make movies about people who have unlimited time and unlimited resources and low stakes. That's where the adventure is, folks. That's where the adventure is. That's where the challenge is, but that's also where the adventure is. So for a lot of us, we look around and go, I don't know how I can do it with this mess. Well, Jesus did it with the 12. Apollo 13 did it. By the way, spoiler alert, they solved it, and they got the people back. Okay? But that's the mess that we kind of inherit. So how do we move forward in that situation when that is where most of us as small church pastors find ourselves? Let me give you one piece of good news. People will come to small churches. Yay! But they won't give up quality to do so. Oh. Now, why does the front half of that sentence excite us and the last half of that sentence deflate us? Here's why. We have a faulty picture of what church quality looks like. And it comes because we too often have big church lenses. And that's not a fault of anybody. It's just simply most of the time when we read the church leadership books and listen to the podcasts and go to the conferences, usually we're hearing from a pastor whose church is significantly larger than ours, and they're teaching us how that happened. But the further apart they get in size from us, the more distant it is from our principles. Here's an example of that. I described this in the Grasshopper Room. There's something that we have that I call IKEA envy. IKEA envy. IKEA envy is this. I want you to imagine that the chairman of Starbucks gets together with their leadership team and says, okay, we've got a vision for the next 10 years for Starbucks, and here's what we've done. We've gone to all the IKEAs in the world. How many of you have never been to an IKEA? All right, I'm about to bless you with a description that will make you not ever have to go. IKEA builds the biggest stores in the world. There are furniture stores that you have to put the furniture together yourself, and that's not even the worst part about IKEA. Several years ago, they put an IKEA next to near us. I hadn't seen it yet. Shelley said one day, we've got to go and buy some furniture, a bookcase or something. Let's go to this new place called IKEA. Okay. So I went there and I drove in, and it is ridiculously big. I'm telling you, the astronauts can see this store from space. It's insanely big. But I've been to big stores before. I've been to the mall before. I've been to, Costco, whatever, and I know what's going to happen. I'm going to walk in. Shelley's going to go this way and get what she wants. I'm going to go over here and try to find something that semi-interests me. And when she's done, she'll text me. I'll meet her. I'll help haul the stuff out to the car. We'll be done. Oh, no, not in an IKEA. Not allowed. If you've ever been in an IKEA, you know. It is a very specific path that you have to follow to get to the end. It's like going through a rat maze. And you can't just wander around. It's designed like, if you've ever seen an actual floor map of an IKEA, it looks like a rat maze. It's crazy. You've got to follow. There are literal arrows on the floor to show you where to go next, because I'm convinced people have been in there for days and starved, and that's why they serve you Swedish meatballs at the end, because you're starving. And you literally have to follow arrows on the floor. So I want you to imagine that the chairman of Starbucks looks at his team and says, for the next 10 years, here's the plan. We've measured all the IKEAs in the world. And the average IKEA is 250,000 square feet. We've measured all of our Starbucks stores, and the average Starbucks is only 800 square feet. We have to fix this if we're going to compete with IKEA. Does that make any sense on any level whatsoever? It doesn't, does it? No, because they're completely different business models. IKEA's business model is huge and in just a few places. Starbucks is very small and everywhere we could possibly fit them. Right? So, in the church, we've got a handful of really large IKEA-sized churches. And in our Starbucks-sized churches, we're hearing from the chairman of IKEA about how IKEA operates, and then we're going, oh, I've got to go home and put arrows on the floor. No, you don't. I've never walked into a Starbucks and needed to see an arrow on the floor to know where to go. It's really obvious. Right? Now, they're not wrong. When you have an IKEA-sized church, and you've got hundreds or thousands of people coming through it on the weekend, you've got to have arrows on the floor precision, or the thing falls to pieces really quickly. And so big churches talk to each other and they share these ideas, and it's very helpful. But once it drops below a certain point, it's not helpful to us, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But the starter point to that is this. We in a Starbucks-sized church are looking at IKEA-sized churches and thinking, quality for me means I got to look like IKEA. No, it means that you need to be a really good Starbucks size. What Starbucks looks like is different. As an example, instead of arrows on the floor precision, if you walk into any Starbucks or even a local coffee shop, which might actually even be a more apropos illustration for this, if you walk into a local Starbucks and you see a bunch of college students in the corner and they're there for hours cramming for finals, Starbucks is not in any hurry to move them through. They gave them plugins and Wi-Fi. Why? They want them to linger. Linger doesn't work in a big Sunday morning church service. Arrows on the floor, service is over, move that group out so we can move the next group in, works in a big church. Lingering works in a small church. That's what people go to small churches for the relational aspect of it. So there are some things we can learn from our friends in larger churches, but there are some things that just don't apply because the Starbucks model is different than the IKEA model. And so bottom line is this: quality looks different in a small church than in a big church. In a big church, quality is often about things like, the musicianship of the worship team, and the size of the facility, and the obviousness of the signage, and you've got greeters in the parking lot who are ready to help you at a moment's notice. And in a small church, we go, you guys have a parking lot? Wow. Right? A lot of it simply doesn't apply across sizes, and that's okay. Quality looks different in a small church than in a big church. And we'll talk about what some of those reasons are as we move along. So the first part of it is that we need to realize that your small church can be an effective church. We can have quality, but it's going to look different. So how is it going to look different? That's point number 2 for this one. We need to discover how small churches function differently from big churches. So what does a healthy small church look like? Let me show you this. We showed you this a little bit last night, and I'll show it to you again. As I was doing research on the differences between church sizes so I could understand how to function differently in different sizes, every book that I read about church size differences, if they used an illustration, the illustration was always stair steps or a ladder. So it's a church of 50, church of 100, church of 500, church of 1,000, church right and up. And if you see a ladder with small numbers on the bottom and big numbers on the top, what does it tell you about the quality of large to small on that ladder immediately when you see the photo? Small bad, big good. That may not be the intention of the person who did the illustration or was writing the book, but that's how an illustration like that hits us, right? Because a ladder is for climbing, after all, right? So I thought, I want to come up with an illustration that shows the differences between big and small without, one, it being competitive, because it's not, or two, without making small feel bad, because I'm coming from a small context. So I came up with the Venn diagram because it's so simple. So on the left, you've got big churches and how they operate. On the right, you've got small churches and how they operate. There will always be a spot in the middle where they meet, where every church has in common. But the bottom line is this: the bigger your church is, the more those circles will overlap. And the smaller a church you're leading, the less those circles will overlap. So as your church gets larger, you will get more and more benefit by paying attention to and learning from big church pastors. The smaller your church is, the less benefit you can receive by listening to how big church pastors do it. Not because they're saying anything wrong, but because their circle is so different from yours. So that's a big part of how it works. And what we've got here is the principle that many big church principles simply don't translate into a small church context. But here's the thing. Nobody told me that. Not at Bible college, not in my early years of ministry. So I would go to the big church conferences, read the big church books, and so on. And I'd go home and I wanted to do everything they talked about, and I didn't realize that up to 2/3 or more of it simply would not apply in my context. It couldn't even be adapted to my context. It was just in a different circle. But first of all, nobody told me that there was a difference, that these differences existed. And secondly, nobody gave me a filter to know which ones did fit and which ones didn't fit. So part of what we're going to walk you through this session is we're going to give you a filter to understand the difference, so that from now on, even if you are learning from a big church pastor, you'll know how to filter and or adapt what they're saying to a small church context. I'm going to give you some of the filter to help you with that, okay? So before we do that, though, I want to add one more thing to this illustration. Call this my Wonder Bread circles. So take a look at these circles inside the right large circle, and you'll notice three characteristics here. First of all, they're all different colors and shades. Secondly, they're different sizes. And thirdly, and most importantly for our conversation today, they don't touch each other. And here's why. Well, the big circle on the right stands for all the things that small churches have in common. The small dots the small dots represent the part about your small church that is different than any other church on the face of the earth. So here's part of the challenge for pastoring and leading a small church. We actually have to master three sets of principles. One, we need to know the church essentials that all churches have to know and all churches have to do. This is mostly what we learn in places like seminaries, okay? So we have to know what is common to all churches. Then, if we're in a small church, we have to know what all small churches share in common. Because some of what you think is unique to your church, if you talk to other small church pastors, you realize, oh, it's not a me thing, it's an us thing, it's a small church thing, right? So you need to know what all churches need to know. You need to know what all small churches need to know and how we do that. But then there's going to be a leftover part where you're going to look at it and go, why is my church so weird? And I'm going to say right now, your church is weird. And it's a different weird than the people in the church in the next table. And here's the inverse correlation. The smaller your church is, the weirder it is. Why? Because people. So, the unique DNA, the larger the unique DNA circle is, the smaller the church is. The smaller the unique DNA is, the bigger the church is. Until finally the unique DNA disappears almost completely, and we're very much the same as everybody else. And it's because of something called the law of large numbers. I learned this a few years ago, and it's really been helpful for me, and now it's been helpful to a lot of other churches as well. Law of large numbers states that the bigger the crowd is, the more predictably it behaves. The larger the crowd, the more predictably it behaves. This is how every polling company works. For instance, you'll hear a poll that says, you know, Americans feel this way about this particular issue, and you go, they didn't talk to me. You know what? They don't need to talk to you or to me. Here's why. If they do three things right, if they ask the right questions, of the right demographic mix, and then third, for our talk today, and if they have a minimum sample size, all they have to do is add zeros because the predictability follows through. So if they survey something, I think at this point is something like 15 or 20,000 Americans, and if they ask the right question of the right demographic group and they have that minimum sample size, all they have to do is add zeros and they're correct within a 3 to 4 point margin of error. They can guess how large your groups, but you've got to have minimum sample size because the larger crowds are required for the statistics to matter. Right? So, I'm going to give you an illustration. If you are pastoring a church of 2,000 and you are at a conference where a pastor of a church of 20,000 is speaking, you can take virtually everything that pastor of a church of 20,000 does, take virtually everything they say and do it in your church of 2,000. Why? Because at that point, the Venn diagram of circles is pretty much just a single circle. There's a few changes, but not many. Right? They got into the same issues with their parking lot. They've got the same age divisions. They've got the same challenges of staffing. They've got, right? It's all the same principles. You just drop a zero and you're good to go. So 20,000 down to 2,000, drop a zero, do it all. 2,000 down to 200, just drop another zero. No, stop. That doesn't qualify anymore. Why? Because at 200, you're beneath minimum sample size. It doesn't mean you're not valuable. It simply means that the statistics don't apply anymore because of size. Okay? It's because all of a sudden, you may not have multiple age divisions. You may not even have a full-time paid pastor anymore. You may not have a facility. So all the stuff they're talking about, facilities and staffing and so on, simply don't apply anymore. As an example, large churches talk about when you meet every week with staff, here's how you run your staff meeting. And the small churches, we're trying to figure out how just to get all the leaders together just one time in the same room. Because they're all working, including quite often the pastor during the week. So just scheduling the meeting, just tell me how to do that first, right? Different challenges in the size. So 20,000 down to 2,000, same thing. 2,000 down to 200, can you just drop a zero? No, it's different. And then if you drop from 200 down to 50, it's really different again, right? And then you can take two churches of 50. They can be of the same denomination, in the same town, on the same street, and you might as well be on two different planets. Why? Because the 50 people in this church are different from the 50 people in this church. See, in this church of 50, when they lose one family, there goes their entire children's ministries department. They didn't just lose the helpers, they lost all the kids. And in this church of 50 over here, when that one person that we all love isn't able to come on a Sunday morning, we all breathe a little bit easier because at least this Sunday we're not going to have that awkward confrontation in the church lobby. And don't any of you act like you don't know what I'm talking about. Because every one of you has a name and face in mind right now. And here's the deal, every church has one. If your church doesn't have one, some other poor church has two. So keep them in prayer. There have been seasons where I've been convinced that there's at least 3 other churches in our area without one, because wow. Now here's the deal. The church of 2,000 also has one of those, but that just means the pastor gets a weird email once a week. That's really kind of easy to deal with. But in a church of 50, that one person can ruin your Sunday. They can split the church. They can drive you out of ministry. Because in the bigger church, it's about statistics and groups and demographics. That's how it has to run when you're that big. That's not wrong, that's not bad, it's simply the nature of size. But in a smaller church, it's not about the graphs and metrics anymore. It's about individual people and their personalities. And that's why the smaller the church is, the weirder it is, because every individual personality affects the whole to a much greater degree. So, instead of fighting against that, how do we lean into that and understand it? That leads to point number 3 for this session, and that's this. How do we understand and use the unique DNA of our small church for God's glory? If the law of large numbers is the bigger the crowd is, the more predictably they behave, then the flip side of the law of large numbers is this. The smaller the crowd is, the more impact each person has, for good and bad. Now, we've already talked about the bad, that weird person who can drive you crazy. But there's also the good. Let me give you a couple of examples. I want you to imagine that you play a little guitar. If you play a little guitar and you go to a mega church and you go and you sit in the Sunday morning service and you listen and maybe sing along as the worship team sings songs from their latest album, you're going to look at it and go, I am never getting on that stage, am I? No, you are not. Wouldn't be good for you, wouldn't be good for them, wouldn't be good for the people who have to listen. Doesn't fit the context. But if you play a little guitar and you show up to a church of 20 on a Sunday morning, you'll be leading in worship in a month. In fact, you may not need to wait a month. If they find out you play guitar, they're going to go, is it in your car now? Right? This is one of the reasons people go to smaller congregations, because their gifts can be used in a smaller context when it might not be usable in a larger context. That's not a diss against the person's gifts. That's not a pushback against the big church. It's not a pushback against the small church. It's simply different circles. Some things apply in the big circles that don't apply in the small. Some things apply in the small that don't apply in the big, including certain giftings. Another example. Shelley and I were traveling a few years ago. We went to a mega church where the conference was held at a mega church. And it happened to be a mega church where I knew the pastor. It was a church of about 2,500, so barely into the mega category. So he was, sad that his church was so small. Just kidding. But I happened to know the pastor from several years before. And so mid-conference at some point, he said, hey, we just did a whole, upgraded the facility. Let me show you. So he showed me around. And they'd hired a design firm that had come in and done some things. They hired a graphic design firm as well. And they moved some walls, they'd upgraded all the color scheme, they put in new logos, everything matched, the signage was great. It was a really great job, and they spent about $250,000 on it, which was not fancy. It was necessary for the size of the building. A church of 2,500, that's $100 a head. That's like a church of 50 spending $5,000 on a total upgrade at the facility. It was a reasonable amount for the size of the church and the size of the congregation. And he did a really good job at it. And as we were driving home, I realized, you know what? That's not how it works in a small church. In a small church, we don't hire a design firm when we want to fix up the facility. You know what we do in a small church? Here's what happens. In a small church, you got a couple ladies in the church who know how to decorate their house nicely. And 4 times a year, they go into the attic or the basement or the back shed, and they pull out the autumn stuff, the Christmas stuff, the Easter stuff, or the 4th of July stuff. And they put it all on a table, and they toss the stuff that broke since last year, or that's just a little too old and we've seen it one too many times. And then they go to Walmart or Dollar General, and they replace it with a few other nice things, or they make a few things of their own. And from one Sunday to the next, people leave one Sunday, and the next Sunday they come back, and the lobby and the sanctuary are decorated beautifully for that season. And the 2 or 3 ladies who decorate their house nicely are able to contribute to the life of that congregation, and in a big congregation, they would not be able to make that contribution. Right? Do I know my audience? Okay. Now, the big church is not wrong for not being able to use them. That's not an appropriate usage of their talents to do that in a mega church size. It doesn't fit. But their gifts can be used in a smaller congregation, and they can bless the church and be thanked by it and know that they've made a contribution to the life of the church. So part of the reason, a big part of the reason a lot of people who attend smaller churches do so, especially in areas like mine where they actually have options to attend really big churches, is because they know they can have impact there. Now, the downside is there can be negative impact too. When personalities conflict, everybody knows about it and it can be an issue. But there's also the positive side where people can use their giftings in a smaller congregation in a way that they can't use it elsewhere. So, with that in mind, let me walk you through one of the main contrasts that I've seen in the way big and small churches operate. Not pitting one against another, never doing that, but just so we can understand the differences. Big churches tend to prioritize processes and systems and programs. And by prioritize, I don't mean that that's what's most important to them. I mean that when the leadership gets together, they spend a lot of time talking about their processes and their systems and their programs. Why? Because when you're moving hundreds or thousands of people through in a weekend, you've got to have good processes and good systems and good programs, or it falls to pieces. Now, in a small church, what we often think is, well, then we need to think more about processes, systems, and programs. And it is true that we should have good processes, we should have good systems, and we should have good programs. But that comes a distant second in small church leadership to 3 other priorities, and they are this. relationships, culture, and history. Now, relationships, culture, and history matter in big churches too, but they approach them completely differently. So let me walk you through this, and it'll give you a filter that will help you in the future as well. First of all, relationships. Every once in a while, I'll have a small church pastor who will ask me, especially when they hear about the discipleship that's happening at our church, what is a good discipleship curriculum that you would recommend for small churches? And I say, pretty much whatever works for you. Now, how can I be that nonchalant about something as important as discipleship, about the curriculum? Here's why. The best way to disciple people is not through curriculum. It's through relationships. The best method ever devised for discipling people is the method used by Jesus, by the Apostle Paul, and by the early disciples. And the method is something we know as mentoring. That is the best way to raise disciples. And at the center of mentoring is relationship. Now here's the thing. We in recent years, the last couple generations, in far too many of our churches, we have replaced mentoring with curriculum. And we think we're discipling people, and all we're doing is getting the classes finished. If relationship is not at the center of it, it's not mentoring and it's not true discipleship. It may be teaching and it may be instruction, and both of those are valuable, and they are aspects of discipleship, but without the relational mentoring aspect of it, it's not true discipleship. And that is what is missing in most of our churches of all sizes. We've got the curriculum, and sometimes it's just easier to teach the curriculum than it is to spend the time to get to know the people in relationship. And whatever size church is, it matters, but especially people who go to small churches, one of the main reasons they go is for the relational aspect of it. So, when we do mentoring in our church, we do it on a relational basis. It's always got a relationship at the center of it. Now, does that mean curriculum's not good? No, not at all. Curriculum is really helpful for two things. One, it keeps us between the proper theological guardrails, so that when we do have people mentoring each other, we can make sure that they're not going off into some ditch that they shouldn't be going off into. And secondly, it gives them a pace that they can keep up so that they don't wander around that way either and take too long or get through it too quickly. So it can give us time markers and it can give us theological guardrails, but it should always be used within relationship for it to become mentoring, for it to be true discipleship. So this has got to be a priority, especially in a smaller church. Now, big church as well, they want to emphasize relationships. But in a big church, the relationships will happen mostly in small groups and ministry teams. The pastor won't be having direct relationships with the members. There are simply too many for that to happen. But in a smaller congregation, as a pastor or as a church leader, we don't have to mentor people. We get to mentor them. So in our story, for instance, when we realized we had been short on discipleship, we haven't been raising leaders, it started with me and my main team leader, who I had discipled. We realized we've got to do the first few groups. We've got to start bringing people in. We're going to conduct that. We're going to mentor people. And then part of the mentoring process was teaching them how to mentor others. And so now we literally have fourth and fifth generation down of people I mentored, who mentored others, who are now stepping up into leadership. But it has to be built around relationship. Secondly, culture. Culture. In a big church, the pastor and staff set the culture. In fact, most big church leadership, when they talk about culture, they will tell you this. First of all, what they'll tell you is this, and it's true. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, what does that mean? Well, when I talk about culture, I'm not talking about this church is contemporary and this church is traditional. That's style, that's not culture. Culture is the unwritten set of rules that governs everything a church does. The unwritten set of rules that governs everything a church does. So, when something happens in a church and they go, or if you present something in your church and they go, that's not how we do it here, that's a statement of culture. Or when they say, well, that's just the way it is around this church, that's a statement of culture. Here's the surprising thing. Some of the strongest culture enforcers in your congregation have no idea they're enforcing culture. It's just what we've always done. And that's not what we ever do. And they're enforcing culture and don't know it. Now, in a big church, when they talk about culture, they'll tell you, as the pastor, you set the culture. You continue to restate the culture. You establish the culture. It has to come from you. Top down, establish the culture, tell people the culture. Now, here's the deal. If you go to a small church and you decide you're going to set the culture, especially, and here are four factors. The older the church is, the older the people in the church are, the newer you are to the church, and the younger you are as a leader, If you go in and you think you're going to call the culture, God bless you at your next church. That is not going to work, folks. The smaller the church is, the more you have to cooperate with them in the establishing of the culture. Here's how it has to work. So what do? You have to go in, especially if you're new in a congregation, and if the congregation has been around a while. Here's how you begin the idea of culture change. First of all, you have to figure out the culture. What is the culture of this church? You have to know what it is. Secondly, you have to show them what you appreciate about that culture. If they think that you don't like their church at all, it'll be like, why are you pastoring here? You've got to find something about the culture that you appreciate and can reflect back kindly on. And only then will they give you limited permission to participate with them in moving the culture forward. Let me restate that because every word matters. First of all, you've got to understand the culture that you're stepping into. Just like last night when we talked about contextualizing your ministry, you've got to understand the community. If you're new to a church, you've got to understand the culture of the community. You've got to understand the culture. Secondly, you have to show them what you appreciate about the culture. That builds the bridge, that builds the common ground, and only then will they allow you to participate with them in moving the culture forward. And the smaller the church is, the longer it's been around, the newer you are and the younger you are, the more those rules apply. They will never not apply in a small church, but when you add those factors to it, they are huge. So in big churches that establish their own culture, it comes from the top down. Why? Because when I walk into a church of 2,000, even if I join a church of 2,000, do I expect to impact the culture of that church? No. I'm either going to buy it and stay or not buy it and leave. I don't expect to change the culture. But in a church of 20 to 50, every person and certainly every family who comes and or leaves affects the culture in some pretty significant ways. We have to adapt to that. Everybody has an impact, whether they intend it or not. It's simply the nature of the smaller group. So we have to look at culture differently in a small church. And then thirdly, history. History. Small towns have long memories. And so do small churches. So when we go into a small church, we have to understand the history. In big churches, they're making history day by day. These are the good old days we're establishing history. In a small church, the history matters in some very significant ways. So what do we do if we go into a congregation and the history of the church feels like an anchor weighing us down rather than a foundation upon which to build? Here's what happened in our church, because I don't know your church, so I can't tell you what to do, but I can give you an example from our congregation that might help you in yours. We've been at our congregation about 10 years or so, and we resurfaced our parking lot. And then one day there was a bunch of noise outside, and I went outside, and there were a bunch of skateboarders in our parking lot, because we live 3 miles from the beach. We live in a surf and skate culture, and after resurfacing the parking lot, we had the smoothest surface in town. So I got together with a youth pastor and we realized we have one of two options. We can either put up a whole bunch of no skateboarding signs, or we can buy some ramps. We didn't have money to buy ramps, so we went out and we found a bunch that people were willing to give to us and built some of our own, and we put up ramps. Because we decided at that point that churches on defense put up signs and churches on offense put up ramps. And since then, for about 15 years, the skateboard park has taken up more parking spaces than we can afford. And it is the only skateboard park in our town. And more kids have come to faith in Christ by first of all coming to skate. And more of their parents and family members have come to faith in Christ because their kids came to skate than all the other programs we've probably done combined in the last 15 years. So, why am I telling you this about history? Here's why. Just last month, October, we celebrated our church's 60th anniversary. 10 years ago, at our church's 50th anniversary, we were going through some of the stuff. We pulled out photos and bulletins and old clippings and so on from when the church was founded. And one of the things I saw was this newspaper article. For those of you who are back there, the title says, "The church can work with delinquents." Now, anybody who's under 30, delinquent doesn't mean they're late in paying their bills. Back in the day when kids were making a mess in the community, we called them juvenile delinquents. Today we call them at-risk youth. That's a better term. But back then we called them juvenile delinquents. So this article was written just a couple years after our church started. And here's how the article begins. As an institutional caseworker and probation officer, I searched for many months for a church really concerned about the needs of juvenile delinquents. Until recently, I could find none. So this is like early 60s. And a probation officer and institutional caseworker is trying to help troubled youth. And he wants to work with the church. And he can't find a church that will say yes, because as the second and third paragraphs say, they didn't want their church kids being messed up by delinquents. They were afraid of bringing people into the church that might actually need their help. Until he says he met a guy and he names the founding pastor of our church, who says, we want to build a new church in a new way. We want to reach out to these kids. We want to build a youth center and a kids center. We want to reach out to these kids. And as I'm reading that, I thought, I got to take a picture of that, because 150 feet to my right is our skateboard park. And I thought, if anybody ever comes to me and says, I can't believe you have a skateboard park in the holy grounds of a church, the founders of this church would be appalled if they knew you were putting a skateboard park in the church. I will pull out my phone, I will show them that and go, you know what the founders of our church said? The church can work with delinquents. Now, not every skateboarder is a delinquent, I understand. But it's a higher percentage, let me tell you. It's a challenge. So, what does that mean? We looked around and we saw a need, but not only that, we look back into the church's history and realize this, in fact, is in line with our church's history. So, if the history of your church feels like an anchor pulling you down rather than a foundation on which to build, here's my first piece of advice. Don't ignore your church's history, go deeper into it. And if not your local congregation, go back and study Wesley a little bit. And go back, and what you will find in the founding documents for your congregation, and obviously in the biography of John Wesley, what you will find is pioneering statements by pioneering leaders. In your founding documents for your congregation, you will not find a statement. I guarantee this. If you find it, I don't know what I'll do. I'll be wrong, I guess. You will not find this in any founding document. You will not find a statement that says, we are here to worship Jesus on this color of carpet forever until the church closes. You will not find that in your founding documents. You will find statements like, we want to reach a new generation in a new way. We want to reach out into our community. There's other churches, we don't see a church in our community that's meeting this particular need. You will find pioneering statements. Why? Because pioneers found churches. And so we then need to go back to the pioneering statements of our founders, because the answer isn't to do what our founders did. It's to think like our founders thought. Take a look at the great pioneers of the faith of the past. What were their pioneering statements? What were their visions of faith statements? What were they like? Don't repeat what they did. Think like they thought. Too many of us think we're honoring the past by doing exactly the same thing. And in most situations, if the people who did those things back then were to come today, they'd go, don't do it that way. That's not the way the culture is now. We make the change because the culture was changing. The culture has changed since then. You've got to update it with that. And it's not talking about theological change or whatever. It's talking about the structures and programs and systems that we have in place. Now, I do not want to hear that any one of you went home and started a skateboard park. That's not the point. Skateboard park fits our culture. You've got to find what fits your culture and do something in a way that fits your current culture. So, what are we going to do here this afternoon? One thing. This afternoon, as soon as we come back from break, we're going to talk about how to discover and use what your church does well. How do you kind of go through that process? Your skateboard park issue. What do you do well? How can you figure that out? And how can you lean into it? And then we'll talk about reaching the next generation, as I talked about last night. When I was in my 30s, our church was mostly in the 60s, and now that I'm in my 60s, most of our leadership is in the 20s and 30s. How does that happen? What principles can we apply universally for that? But let me conclude this session with this note of encouragement. If you do pastor a small church, I've got news for you. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. There we go. We've got those two. Here we go. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. For years I thought that it was. What am I doing wrong? It's church is staying small. What am I doing wrong? Turns out I wasn't really doing anything wrong. That wasn't the reason my church was small. I got good news for you. Jesus did not wake up this morning depressed by the size of your church. You may have, but he didn't. You've got just what you need. You don't need anybody else. Now, if you have more, that's great. But I've read through the New Testament more than once, you'll be happy to know. And as I read through the New Testament, I don't see a single command to the church that cannot be done by 2 or 3 people who love Jesus, who love each other, and who want to share their faith with a hurting world. Not a single command in the New Testament that I look at and go, oh, I can't do that yet, I don't have enough money. Oh, I can't do that yet, I don't have enough people. Oh, I can't do that yet, we don't have the right building. Not a single command that requires that. So pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. So what is it? It's a specialty. It's worth doing well. God has you where he has you for a reason. He's not surprised by it. He's not upset by it. He's not depressed by it. We can do right now everything God is calling our church to do right now. Somehow we get this picture in our head that if we only had more people, we'd have fewer problems. More people, fewer problems. Have you met people? No, you just get different problems. We can do what God is calling us to do right now. I pray that we will find and discover that for our own church, and that you will be able to take that home. So we're going to take a look at those 2 things this afternoon. We're going to go into lunch now. Let's get the instruction about how to do that. Thank you.